Introduction. Do you often get the feeling that your diet isn't providing you with the nutrition and vitamins you need? Do you often feel tired or lack energy, even though you feel like you eat well enough or get enough sleep? Are you looking for ways to improve your digestive function without resorting to expensive medications and procedures? You can improve your life by making some simple but meaningful adjustments to the way you eat. Fermentation is the process of more effectively breaking down the food you eat during the digestive process so that it can provide you with more nutrients and nutrition. The process of fermenting breaks food down into smaller compounds. This process of fermenting breaks food down into smaller compounds. This process creates new flavors, tastes, and textures. And it can even enhance the existing nutritional content of food. Let's get to grips with what fermentation means and how it can be beneficial for you. A large part of the human body, over 60%, is made of bacteria, which means that our bodies contain living organisms. These organisms act within the human body to break down food and convert it into chemicals and substances that can be absorbed by the body. Fermented foods help to aid this process, which also makes the process of digestion easier. This means there is less stress on your body, and less stress means you feel a lot better and your body works more efficiently. You'll have more energy to do the things you really want to do. The gut is central to physical, mental, emotional, and many other different kinds of health. When your gut is out of balance, the rest of your body starts to feel the strain. Fermentation is an age-old process that has been used to take care of food and preserve it for centuries. It is a great way of keeping your pantry stocked with food, even when you don't have access to more traditional ways of storing and preserving food, while also helping to boost your digestive system. In this book, we'll discuss the basics of fermentation and how you can start your own fermentation projects. We'll examine recipes, hints, tips, and tricks of all kinds on how to preserve your food and make it healthier at the same time. So, whether you are just a prepper looking for ways to more effectively preserve and store your food, or you're a health guru looking to add more probiotic-rich foods to your diet, this is the book for you. In the modern world, fermentation is making a resurgence due to the health benefits associated with it. Fermented foods and drinks are loaded with probiotics, which help to enhance digestive health. There are also many other reasons why you'd want to start fermenting your own food. Apart from preservation of food and health reasons, fermented food just tastes amazing. If you're new to the process of fermenting, don't worry. This book will introduce you to the basic techniques and guides you'll need to master the fermentation process. Once you've mastered these techniques, you'll be able to move on to more advanced projects. We'll give you the basics on what kinds of foods you can ferment, what techniques you can use to ferment, and how to prepare fermented foods safely and hygienically. So, whether you're a seasoned fermenter or a beginner to the process, there is something for you in this guide. Who is this book for? This book is intended for those who have an interest in improving their diet and their health through the incorporation of new foods and who are willing to put in a bit of effort. Fermenting does require a few ingredients and some time, but for those who are willing to make the effort, it is worth the results to get tastier meals and to experience a healthy body, soul, and mind. This book is perfect for those familiar with fermenting who want to expand on their experiences, those who are just starting out and want to learn more about the experience, and for those who might not have an interest in health specifically, but who just want to experiment with making tasty food. No matter who you are and what walk of life you come from, you'll find something in this book to draw you in. The book itself contains a number of mouth-watering recipes made with fermented ingredients, and it also shows you how to apply fermentation techniques to food to make it more interesting and tastier. The guide contains step-by-step recipes, helpful hints, and the basics of fermentation. Not everyone has an idea of what to do when they first start out on the fermentation journey. Not to worry, this guide has you covered. Who is this book not for? This book is not for those who don't have the time to work with and prepare ingredients, or those who don't cook often. Fermenting is not a quick and easy process, and you might find yourself working with ingredients you're unfamiliar with. Those readers looking for a quick fix might be disappointed. The process can sometimes take a while, but it is well worth the effort and time once the first bite of tasty food goes into your mouth. This book is also not intended as a tell-all book on the benefits of different kinds of food. It is not a dietitian's handbook, and it is not intended to be a scientific guide. This book doesn't cover all the health benefits involved with fermenting, but it does offer a brief overview of these health benefits. How to use this book. This helpful guide contains several sections, each dedicated to a specific kind of food or set of ingredients. The guide also highlights the numerous benefits associated with fermenting food and shows how your life will change once you elect to incorporate fermenting techniques into your diet. The first section starts by covering the basics of fermenting. These processes are the building blocks for understanding how fermentation works, and they are foundational and critical in knowing how to produce your own fermented foods and how these foods can make you fitter and healthier. We'll learn about the history of fermenting and how it came to be the staple of many healthy diets. We'll look at the foods that work best for fermenting and how to set up your kitchen and pantry so that you can start producing fermented foods. Next, we'll look at the benefits of fermenting. It's all good and well to ferment your own food, but if you don't understand why you're doing it and why it's important to you, you're not going to get very far because you don't really have a purpose or motivation to carry on with this diet. Any successful diet starts with a passion and understanding of the concepts involved in it. Different fermented foods affect the body in different ways. We're going to discover some of these ways on this journey together. We'll examine the most commonly asked questions about the process and address some of its finer points. What do fermented foods do to the body? How can fermenting your foods improve digestion and improve your life? What are some of the lesser-known benefits of eating fermented food? All these questions and more are addressed. Following that, we'll look at how fermentation works scientifically. We'll examine what occurs when food is fermenting and what the changing nature of food looks like when it is exposed to different temperatures, substances, and preservation processes. We'll really break down what it means to ferment food. The science of fermentation is interesting when considering both alcohol and food items. Beer and wine, in particular, have been some of the most consumed fermented drinks throughout history. But how did the science behind these beverages develop? Our next section deals with what you need to get started on your journey to fermenting food. You'll need a few specific ingredients and some household kitchen items to get going. You'll also have to consider how you're going to start planning the fermenting process. What steps do you need to follow? How do you need to prepare before starting? There are some sanitation and safety concerns you'll have to follow before and during the process itself so that your food is suitable to eat. Finally, there are some common pitfalls to look out for. It's always a good idea to know what could possibly go wrong during the fermenting process so that you can avoid these common mistakes. Our next section begins to deal with the food itself. What kinds of foods can be fermented? Well, the answer is many. From vegetables to meat, fish, cheese, fruits, and grains. There are so many options that it's hard to know where to begin. Fortunately, this guide helps you to remain focused on what's most important. Start with the basic food items, and when you're confident in the process, you can start working your way up. A separate section is provided for all your beverage needs. There is more to fermenting than just making alcohol, although this is a large part of it. There are many non-alcoholic fermented drinks that you can consume from all over the world. We're going to look at some of these, as well as the process that goes into making them. Then, we'll look at the grains themselves. These are particularly significant when considering how they react with the fermentation process. Overall, you have freedom of choice to use whatever ingredients you want in the fermentation process. Just make sure to follow the recipes involved step by step. This way, you'll end up with food that is not only tasty, but also good for you. Finally, we're going to look at different kinds of fermentation techniques you can make use of. Specific techniques you're going to learn about include dehydrating and pickling, among others. In an additional section, we'll also discuss how gut health works and how fermented foods can change your life through the way they boost your immune system and bring vitality to your entire body. The road to better and healthier eating starts here. And if you're interested in learning more about fermenting and self-sufficiency, make sure to head over to selfreliantbooks.com for more. Chapter 1. Fermenting Fundamentals. Introduction to Fermentation. What is fermentation? Fermentation is the process of tiny microbes called bacteria breaking down organic matter, be it in plants or animal products. In a general sense, this process can be used to create and produce foods that would not otherwise be possible to create. If you've ever bitten into food and found it tangy, sharp, or sour, you more than likely have these kinds of bacteria to thank. You can find the byproducts of fermentation in foods all around you, such as cheese, chocolate, beer, bread, yogurt, and many others. Fermentation is many things, but at its heart, it involves working with bacteria to create chemical reactions within food so as to change the nature and structure of it. This might not sound very exciting. In fact, it may sound downright dangerous. I mean, who wants to introduce bacteria into their food? It doesn't sound like the most genius of ideas when one looks at it on the surface. But the reality is, as we alluded to earlier, that bacteria is all around us and in our bodies. Some of it is good and some of it isn't. We need to harness the power of friendly bacteria in our bodies and in our food and get them working for us. Food itself is full of bacteria of all kinds, and these friendly bacteria interact with our body in different ways. Fermentation can be defined as the way in which food is broken down by these microorganisms, often resulting in the release of heat, effervescence, and other properties. Let's look at an example. Lactic acid-forming bacteria can convert a low pH food into a high pH food by consuming the carbohydrates in the food and transforming them into acid. This means that foods with low nutritional value can sometimes suddenly be transformed into superfoods. While the word superfood tends to be an overused concept nowadays, foods affected by fermentation have more available vitamins due to the digestion of these carbohydrates. What this means, in layman's terms, is that the unnecessary nutritional content of fermented food is lessened, and the more important and healthy parts of the food are left behind. And if the nutritional content isn't enough, they also taste delicious. Fermented foods are also more shelf-stable than many other kinds of foods. The strong flavors of fermented foods may not suit everyone's tastes, and we realize that. The health benefits, however, make it worth considering. These benefits include gut health, improved absorption of foods, and reduced inflammation. This is due to the friendly bacteria that come with such probiotic-rich food. They help to break down food more efficiently in the intestine and maintain balance within the gut. But more on that later. Let's take a look at how this entire process came to be. The history of fermentation. How did fermentation come about? Did someone in the distant past accidentally drop some food into malt vinegar or another substance, pull it out and say, this tastes great? What exactly happened? This actual story behind how fermenting came to be is thousands of years old and has been going on since the dawn of time. Even before the development of alcoholic beverages, humans had encountered different kinds of fermented foods, such as dairy, for example. Unfortunately, dairy wasn't the best substance to keep for long periods of time, and it tended to spontaneously ferment rather than undergo a specific process of planned fermentation. The existing microflora within the milk of cows, sheep, and goats tended to form its own peculiar flavor and texture. The climate of the regions where these cattle were raised also played a role in how their milk underwent this spontaneous fermentation process. Higher temperatures made milk turn sour and changed the chemical nature of it. It has been speculated that the first yogurts were produced by carrying milk within cloth bags and draping them over the backs of camels. This was, of course, most common in desert areas or where the temperatures were warmer. This environment enhanced the process of fermentation and kept the bacteria actively growing and developing. Humans hunted and gathered food for thousands of years, and they were aware of this process. However, they did not always know how to make use of it to their advantage. In fact, scholars believe that the discovery and use of fermentation in the human diet allowed civilizations to settle down and become more established because they were able to store food for longer periods. This meant that there was less waste. The fermentation process allowed people in different regions to store and ferment food, which led to the production of items such as cheese and fermented ingredients for bread. It was not, however, until the 1800s where fermentation really began to take on a more controlled nature. Before this time, people knew how the process worked, but had not yet learned to control it because they did not understand the science behind how bacteria could work within food to change the chemical nature of it. That all changed when in 1856, a chemist by the name of Louis Pasteur discovered the link between yeast and the process of fermentation. He originally defined fermentation as the process of breathing without air. At the time these discoveries were made, fermentation was still used as the primary means of preserving food, rather than for dietary reasons. With the discovery that yeast could cause the process of fermentation, new kinds of cheese and different types of fermented products became available. This led to the mass production of a whole new line of edible items, such as different varieties of beer and specific kinds of wine. Fermented products began to be used in the industrial world, such as the production of bread products, including sourdough and rye, among others. It wasn't until the early 20th century that improving digestive health by consuming fermented foods became an idea, and it took many more years before the idea became mainstream. Russian bacteriologists noticed that specific cultural groupings lived longer than others due to their diet, and they wanted to find out why. Longer lifespans at this time in world history were rarer, and thus represented a source of fascination to researchers. Bacteriologists identified that specific cultures consumed greater amounts of fermented milk products than other groups, and that their lifespans were longer. The bacteria that was discovered to be present in these milk products were called Bulgarian bacillus, after the place they were first discovered. This bacteria, however, was later found to be unable to survive in the human digestive tract. All these peculiar discoveries led to further research into different strains of bacteria, and some were discovered that were, in fact, able to survive inside the human body. In 1900, it was discovered that bacteria could actually be used as a form of food preservation through the process of fermentation. With no access to refrigeration units, the only other alternative was salting or pickling food, often with delicious results. These foods generally tended to take the form of sourdough bread, beer, wine, cheese, and other goods with fermented ingredients in them. People at this time didn't know much about the scientific methods of controlling bacteria to make it behave in specific ways as much as they do nowadays. But they did know that you could control bacteria through the application of heat and temperatures, and by changing the nature of the environment that the bacteria were in. This meant that they could exclude or avoid certain kinds of environments if they wanted food to develop during the fermentation process in a specific kind of way. What eventually ended up happening was that fermenting became the go-to method of preserving, which then led to more consumption of these foods, which led to people being healthier overall. As more people developed an appetite for fermented foods, the craze took off and it became more and more popular. The science of fermentation. Fermentation is a process that uses microorganisms known as bacteria to change the properties of food. The actual word ferment comes from the Latin word fervere, which means to boil. There are certain scientific principles that are important to know about before you start the fermentation process. During fermentation, yeast and bacteria convert carbohydrates into acids. This process works without oxygen, and it is known as an anaerobic process, which means that you can ferment foods in containers where no air is present. In fact, it is vital that there is no oxygen present, as this can interfere with the fermentation process. In some rare cases, such as in the case with yogurt, there is oxygen present. There are tiny organisms that are responsible for the process of fermentation. These are known as fermenters. The most common of these are yeast and bacteria, as we've already discussed. There are also many different kinds of yeast, but for the purposes of your fermentation projects, the only two that you'll need to be aware of are brewer's yeast and baker's yeast, both exhibiting different properties. There are three main kinds of fermentation: alcohol fermentation, lactic acid fermentation, and acetic acid fermentation. Alcoholic is the most common type of fermentation, and it is used in the production of beverages such as beer, wine, and other fermented drinks. Lactic acid fermentation is used in food preservation. During this process, sugars are converted into lactic acid by the bacteria. This process is common in the production of yogurt, cheese, pickles, and other similar food items. The last kind of fermentation is acetic acid fermentation, which is commonly used in the production of vinegar and kombucha. During this process, alcohol is converted by the bacteria into acetic acid. Fermentation in the modern world. There have been many studies conducted in the field of science surrounding fermentation and the bacteria which play a role in it. More recently, specific studies have been conducted which have displayed a link between friendly bacteria in the gut and improved digestion and general detoxification of the body. You can find these products under the name probiotic, and they can be found either in food form or in the form of medications designed specifically for the purpose of rebalancing the flora in the gut. What this means is that when there is too much harmful bacteria in the gut and not enough beneficial bacteria, the gut is out of balance. When you take these products, they help to restore that balance. There are also benefits to fermenting food, namely the ability to prevent food waste through the preservation of food for long periods. Being able to eat food that was prepared and stored means that you don't need to go out and buy it every week. And if you don't have to go out and buy more food, then you save both time and money. Fermenting food means you don't have to make use of a freezer or fridge as well, thus also saving on energy. With all the talk about climate crisis, It is as important as ever to try and save costs and reduce energy usage wherever possible. Fermenting is a low-tech solution to an often overly complicated problem. How it fits into the modern world is by reminding us that living a simple life is often healthier. Making small changes to the way we live can often have profound effects on our lives. Fermentation is a process that requires time and preparation, and it is about the experience as much as it is about the end result. You start at one point and you grow, learn, and make mistakes, and eventually you create something satisfying and beautiful. The process of fermenting in the modern world takes us back to how our ancestors once lived. It reminds us that simple practices can sometimes be as effective as modern and more complex practices. What can you ferment? Having said all this, the key to fermenting lies in the combination of ingredients you decide to use. Almost any food can be fermented, which is the beauty of the process. If you have a specific food preference, it will most certainly be enhanced by the addition of tasty ingredients. Many people focus on vegetables or meat when they're fermenting for the first time, and barley and rye can form the basis for many fermented beverages. Fruit can be preserved in acidic substances to improve the flavor, texture, and nutritional value. Despite the fact that you can ferment many different kinds of foods, though, there are some that work better than others. As a beginner, you want to avoid getting into the more technical kinds of foods when you're starting out. A great vegetable to start off with when you're still new to the process is cabbage. This vegetable is an amazingly versatile ingredient that pairs well with different acidic ingredients, tastes fantastic, and is healthy for you. In its fermented form, cabbage is sometimes known as sauerkraut and is simple to prepare. It lasts for a long time and does not require tons of ingredients to make. A more comprehensive recipe will be provided later in this guide, but the process involves taking a lot of compatible ingredients, adding them to a jar, and leaving them to do their own thing. Fermentation is not only easy, but it's a pleasurable experience as well. Of course, there is some labor involved, as is the case with most cooking, but you can choose practically any ingredient that takes your fancy. Find out what works with it and get fermenting right away. Other fascinating foods which will be delved into in more depth include kimchi, kefir, yogurt, cheese, kombucha, and more. The sky's the limit when it comes to what you can ferment. Whatever you decide to use, it's sure to be absolutely delicious if you follow the correct processes. But even if you mess up at the beginning and your kitchen is full of unfinished fermentation processes in various stages of development, don't despair. Every project is an opportunity to grow, learn, and develop as you find out more about this fascinating process and how it can change your life. Frequently asked questions about fermenting. There are numerous questions that first-time fermenters might have. As a beginner, you may wonder how it is possible to mess the process up. Surely it is as easy as putting some ingredients together, right? Well, the process of fermenting is slightly different than other ways of cooking and preparing food. In fact, you're not really cooking at all. You're rather assembling ingredients in such a way that it produces a chemical reaction in the food. We realize that this can sound intimidating, and thus we've assembled a list of commonly asked questions. This checklist of questions has been put together in order to help you gather information from what other people have said and the issues they've encountered. It is hoped that this list will address some of the sticking points related to what you can ferment, the most basic tools and materials you'll need, and also help ease your mind if you start to see the food react in an odd or unusual way. Finally, it is worth noting that there are so many different kinds of foods and different varieties of fermentation. One could compile a list of all the issues one could encounter for every kind of food that is possible to ferment. This would fill several volumes, though, so the list provided is restricted to the most general issues possible. It does not, for example, dive into why your sauerkraut isn't pickling in the most effective way or why your kimchi is turning blue. Can I safely eat fermented food? The first and most common question that most people have when they first hear of fermentation, or one of the concerns that they have about the process, is whether or not the food produced by fermentation is dangerous to eat due to being filled with bacteria. We're taught from a young age that bacteria and germs are not good to have in our bodies, and one must wonder if this kind of thinking has done more harm than good over the years. There are legitimate concerns over hygiene when preparing fermented foods, but for the most part, many of the fears surrounding the danger of eating fermented food stem from misinformation or misunderstanding. The first thing to realize is that the idea of fermented food can be scary and exciting. It's a step into the unknown. With this being said, we are happy to report that there are no documented cases of food poisoning being caused by eating fermented food. In fact, eating food that has been fermented in a controlled environment has actually been shown to reduce the risk of harmful bacteria in the gut and to proliferate the growth of friendly bacteria. This, however, comes with the caveat that food needs to be prepared in line with government guidelines in order to be consumed safely. Never engage in unsafe or unsanitary practices when preparing food, and in this way, you should remain happy and healthy. What about the issue of botulism in food? Botulism is more commonly associated with canned food than fermented food. When a can is damaged for any number of reasons, bacteria starts to form within it. Even a tiny hole within the can admit bacteria and cause it to proliferate. This is why you should always avoid cans that are dented or damaged. Even if they don't look punctured, they might still be. But in general, botulism is a low risk nowadays due to rigorous sanitation procedures within factories and also within homes around the world. In addition, you don't need to worry too much about catching botulism from fermented food, as this kind of bacteria forms within low salt and low acidity environments, both of which are completely the opposite of the fermented food environment. Fermented food is prepared in conditions which are harmful to unfriendly bacteria, and thus this food is safe to consume. So, what are the dangers associated with fermented food? As with any other foodstuff, fermented foods do need to be handled with care. We live in an imperfect world, and things do indeed go wrong. Issues that arise with fermented foods occur while the food is in the process of fermenting. Rest assured that you'll be aware when something is wrong with your project, though, because your nose will alert you to that fact. Let's start at the beginning. The main danger with fermented food is that it can pick up some kind of unwanted microbe, which can make you sick if you eat it. As soon as plants are picked from the soil, they die, as with any other living creature. And when these plants die, they begin to decay, leading to the formation of bacteria. Thus, it is critical that this process of bacteria formation within plants be controlled if they are going to be kept healthy and safe to eat. When plants decay, they begin the long, slow process of transformation into organic matter that is used by organisms within the soil that they grow in. In order to facilitate this process, mold, fungi, and bacteria begin their work of breaking down the plant so that it can be used by the environment around it. However beneficial these microbes are for the soil and for the environment, we definitely don't want them within our bodies, as they are not meant to be there. In short, the danger with fermented food is that it can make us sick if it hasn't been prepared the right way or if there is mold within it. How can I know if my food has gone bad? The most common way you'll spot when your fermentation project is off is through your sense of smell. If something doesn't smell right, it probably isn't safe to eat. If you see mold or mildew growing on the inside of the container or on the food itself, it's a sure sign that the food has gone off. Discard it immediately. If you're uncertain as to whether food is off or not, rather err on the side of caution and toss it in the garbage. Can I use tap water when making my fermented food? We recommend using distilled water when making your fermented food, as this will ensure that your food is free of impurities. Do I need to refrigerate fermented food? It is important to refrigerate all fermented food and drink, as this will help you to keep them for longer periods of time and extend their shelf life. Some kinds of fermented foods will go off if they aren't kept in the fridge. Freezing is also a great way to store fermented foods for a longer period of time. How long will fermented food last? The good news is that fermented food will last for absolute ages, months even. So there's no danger of it spoiling if it's kept under the right conditions. It's perfect to have around when you're not able to easily store perishable items. We do, however, recommend that you consume most fermented foods within about 2 weeks of preparation in order to completely remove the risk of foodborne illness. Is there anything that doesn't ferment well? We don't recommend fermenting meat or fish due to the presence of harmful bacteria within their flesh. Usually, they would be cooked in order to remove these harmful bacteria. But with fermentation, the substances involved won't kill or stop the spread of these bacteria. There are certain kinds of fish and meat which can be pickled, but to be on the safe side, we recommend that you stick to dairy products, vegetables, grains, and fruits for the most part. Is fermenting expensive? No! Fermenting is actually extremely cost-effective. You may even save money by storing food for longer periods of time and reducing waste in your home. What's the difference between pickling and fermenting? Aren't they the same thing? A common misconception is that pickling and fermenting are related to each other. While there are certain similarities, the process of fermentation is a more laborious process that can often take many days due to the need to form the right kind of food culture or bacteria within the food. Pickling is simply the process of taking meat, fish, vegetables, grains, or fruit and adding them to a sharp, acidic, or salty liquid for a few days. Some of the foods prepared in this way will actually end up being fermented, but in general, fermentation is a more involved process than pickling and is quite different. Remember that when we're fermenting, we're creating a favorable environment for friendly bacteria to grow and change the very chemical nature of the food itself. It is an intricate process and requires patience. What are the benefits of fermented food? This is one of the most commonly asked questions, if not the most commonly asked question. It will be addressed in more thorough detail later on in this guide, but it is safe to say that the benefits of fermented food are numerous. In short, the reason why fermented food is so good for you is because it replaces the harmful and unnecessary bacteria within your gut with friendly and necessary bacteria. Many people don't realize this, but your gut is central to the health of your entire body. An unhealthy gut affects every aspect of your body, your mind, your emotions, your hormones, you name it. It is incredible how much better you feel when your gut is in balance, and eating fermented food is the first step in this journey. There's a lot more to this, but the main thing to remember is that fermented food has incredible power to take the food you eat and to supercharge it with important vitamins, nutrients, and the friendly bacteria you need. Can you ferment vegetables with vinegar? Vinegar isn't the best medium for fermentation because it actually prevents vegetables from breaking down by preserving them. It hinders the formation of friendly bacteria that help to catalyze the proteins and carbohydrates in food, and thus the fermentation process is slowed down completely. Strains of bacteria that thrive within vinegar are a completely different kind to the type that help with the processes of fermentation. And thus, vinegar should not be part of the fermentation process. Do lacto-fermented vegetables contain dairy? The answer to this is simple. No. Vegetables fermented in this manner do not contain any dairy. The word lacto refers to the bacteria which are produced during the fermentation process, known as the lactic acid bacteria. These bacteria are responsible for converting sugars into lactic acid. Incidentally, lactic acid within the fermentation process gives the food its characteristically tangy flavor. This is true of all foods fermented in this manner. Does whey help the fermentation process? Whey is not necessary during the fermentation process. It is a starter and is not needed in order to get food to ferment. Natural sugars and salts within the food itself will aid this process. There's no need to add an additional dairy product. In fact, adding whey can often ruin the fermentation process because two kinds of bacteria now have to coexist, animal and plant bacteria. In order to avoid problems, stay away from adding whey to anything. What are some common mistakes people make when fermenting? The most common mistake people tend to make when fermenting is not keeping their containers tight enough, thus allowing moisture and air to access the food inside the container. This interferes with the fermentation process and causes mold and mildew to grow on the food. What special equipment do I require? The good news is that you don't need many special kinds of tools or equipment. The actual process of setting up your fermentation project is simple for the most part. All you're going to require are the following easy-to-obtain household items: glass jars, lids, good quality salt, water. This is the extent of the main equipment you'll need. It is helpful to have various containers of different sizes with different lids, as this will help you to store different kinds of ingredients. The only other requirement is the food itself. You have to decide what you want to work with or what you feel most comfortable working with. Overall, these are some of the main questions people tend to ask when they tackle the subject of fermenting for the first time. It's a complex process, although the steps appear easy. There is much to learn, and a lot of what you do learn is through experience and practice. So never be afraid to take a risk. You might find out something new. Chapter 2. The Benefits of Fermenting. The benefits of fermented food can be divided into different sections depending on where and how they are affecting the human body, and also how they are beneficial in general. For example, fermented foods boost your immune system, but they are also beneficial because they cut down on food waste in the kitchen. We need to examine both the general and specific effects of eating and working with fermented foods. Why ferment? Let's talk about why fermenting is so important to the human body in particular. People have been clamoring over fermented foods for more than ever in recent times. But the reality of the situation is that we've been eating fermented foods for many thousands of years before now. So, why the recent hype over fermented food? Recently, the healing properties of fermented food have been rediscovered after many years in the wilderness. Until just recently, the focus had all been about fermentation as a way to preserve food, and the use of the process did not extend far beyond that. But with more modern scientific methods of analyzing these processes, we were able to determine that fermented foods were, in fact, healthy for us. There are many benefits to fermented food. It enhances taste, improves the vitality of food ingredients, and helps increase the shelf life of food. So, in answer to the question, why ferment, we could respond, why not? Fermentation can only benefit the human body because it introduces loads of helpful bacteria into our systems that are not only beneficial to us, but we actually need them in order to effectively digest food. How fermenting aids digestion. Trillions of bacteria live inside your body, but this is no reason to be squeamish. These are actually healthy bacteria whose only purpose is to try and survive on the nutrients that they take from your gut. When they do so, They convert these substances into chemicals that are beneficial for your body. Think of it like having pets inside of you. And, as with any kind of pet, you have to provide food for them all. Diets which are unbalanced and heavily reliant on unhealthy carbs, fats, and proteins will inhibit the growth of healthy bacteria in the gut and encourage unhealthy bacteria to grow instead. Fermented foods aid digestion by maintaining balance within the gut. These fermented foods actually create a fertile breeding ground for necessary bacteria. And this is how the digestive process starts. Good and healthy bacteria break down the complex carbohydrates that are in your food. This metabolizing process results in the production of other substances that your body needs as well. Probiotic benefits of fermentation. Fermented foods are a great source of lactic acid bacteria. These bacteria work within the gut to break down foods so that they are digested more effectively by your body. The resulting effects mean that your digestive issues, if you have any, are all alleviated. There are, however, a number of considerations as far as adding probiotics to your diet are concerned. The amount of bacteria in fermented food tends to vary, and not all of the bacteria will even make it to the digestive tract where they can begin their work. There are a number of factors which determine how effective they are at helping your digestive system, such as the type of food that they are delivered in, among other factors. As natural carbohydrates and sugars have already been synthesized, fermented foods are generally easier to digest. As a quick example, the probiotic bacteria that breaks down lactose into simpler sugars, such as glucose and galactose, can actually be beneficial to those who are lactose intolerant. It enables them to eat these foods without fear that they're going to be sick, because the harmful product is already broken down in the food. Fermented milk products will be easier to digest. Fermented foods have higher health potential due to the action of these probiotic bacteria. Fermentation has the power to pack more nutrients into the foods you eat. This is not only because your body's ability to absorb nutrients is enhanced, it is also due to the fact that when fermentation takes place, anti-nutrients are removed from the food and only the helpful nutrients and vitamins are left behind. You're putting a lot less harmful nutritional content into your body, and you're boosting it with only the best that is left inside the food once the probiotic bacteria have finished their work. Boosting your immune system with fermentation. The high probiotic content of fermented food means that it can boost your immune system. This means you're less likely to fall sick or catch a cold due to having a compromised immune system. If you do fall sick, you're more likely to recover quickly due to having a stronger immune system. In addition to all this, fermented foods have also been shown to be high in vitamin C, iron, and zinc, which are all necessary vitamins and nutrients that the body needs in order to be healthy and strong. Nutritional benefits of fermentation. There are numerous other benefits of fermented food that fall into the category of what is nutritional. Of course, every food has its own selection of nutrients, and these are only boosted through the fermentation process. One of the most nutritious and healthy groups of fermented foods are vegetables. Fermented vegetables are high in microorganisms, which generate nutrients such as vitamin C, vitamin B and all its subgroups, vitamin K, and many others. The friendly bacteria also consume the sugars found in vegetables and convert them into acids. This process of lactofermentation can actually destroy harmful compounds within your digestive system. No wonder you feel healthy and energetic after eating a meal containing fermented food. Additional benefits of fermentation. There are other benefits to fermenting your food, not least of which is the fact that fermenting food makes the vitamins within it more available to be absorbed by the body. This is known as making nutrients bioavailable. Iron and zinc are more able to be absorbed after consuming fermented foods. The process of lactofermentation also releases important nutritional compounds such as proteins, amino acids, antioxidants, and other important vitamins. Chapter 3. The Science Behind Fermentation. Fermentation is as much about the science of how bacteria behave as it is about anything else. Bacteria are fascinating organisms because there are many varieties of them, and they all function in different ways when they find themselves in specific environments. Understanding how bacteria work and behave allows us to control them, and thus it is important that we delve into the ins and outs of fermentation science before we begin our own projects. The genetics of fermentation. Microorganisms, such as bacteria, contain very different genetic codes, which allows each strain of bacteria to produce specific enzymes that interact differently with food. During the fermentation process, a number of organisms are present in varying proportions. Each of these unique organisms has a specific role in the fermentation process. Not one strain of bacteria is exactly like another, and this leads to different kinds of tastes, flavors, and textures once the fermentation process is done. Think of the fermentation process like a symphony, where each part of the orchestra has their part to play. It is the same with bacteria. Each contributes to the overall whole in a significant way, and they all have different roles to play. The history of fermentation. The early days. Wine fermentation has been documented as having started around 7000 BC. In ancient times, wine producers typically crushed grapes with their feet in large vats or specific pits designed for that purpose. It was speculated that the microorganisms on the feet of those who were doing the pressing were responsible for the fermentation of the wine. Many more centuries later, in the 1700s, this hypothesis was found to be partially true. Organisms that were thought to be on the feet could be viewed with the use of high-quality optical lenses for the first time. These were the organisms that were found to be linked to the process of fermentation. Louis Pasteur, the famous French microbiologist, found that the bacteria responsible for the process of fermentation were known as yeast, and that they were, indeed, attached to our feet. Further discoveries. In 1856, an accident at a sugar beet factory led to an even more amazing discovery, and actually was responsible for the processes that led to the making of yogurt and cheese as we know it today. It just so happened that the man tasked with investigating the accident was none other than Pasteur himself, and he discovered that instead of alcohol, the substances left behind had a sour taste due to the presence of yeast. The beets were not spoiled. They had simply begun to ferment. The sour beetroot mix also contained a number of organisms even smaller than yeast. This was the bacteria itself. This was a breakthrough discovery because it proved that bacteria and yeast are different organisms, and thus both have a different effect on the fermentation process. Yeast is a living plant, and bacteria are also microscopic animals, but they are not technically plants. Both produce carbon dioxide and other substances when they synthesize carbohydrates and sugars within food, all with varying implications. In the early 1900s, Nobel laureate Edward Buchner discovered that fermentation could take place with cell-free yeast extract. It was a move away from what was traditionally thought to be necessary for fermentation. Cellular fermentation could be substituted for enzyme-driven fermentation. Today we understood to a much better extent how fermentation can be controlled. However, in the area of industrial fermentation, we are still always looking for new ways to improve and to streamline the process. More technologies focusing on the areas of genetics and the foods we eat can improve the flavor and texture of food in ways that would never have been possible in the past. In a sense, the science behind fermentation laid the groundwork for what would eventually follow in the future. We still have the practices that we had in the past, and we can use them, but we can do so much more than we ever thought possible with these practices. DNA sequencing and fermentation technology. Today, we've progressed a long way since those earlier days when we didn't really fully understand how to control the process of fermentation. Nowadays, not only do we control it, but we are also working on scientific methods to make it better and more effective than ever before. As a result, we're creating tastier, healthier food that can last longer and store longer. This is changing the face of the way we eat all over the world. The amazing thing about fermentation is that it can be customized. It combines the elements of past technology with the newer and more modern technologies. Through studying bacteria in detail, we've been able to find out a lot more about how they work. Scientists have discovered that during the fermentation process, the ratio of microbial populations to food can alter depending on ambient and external temperature. Different kinds of bacteria thrive at different temperatures. At lower pH levels, certain kinds of bacteria thrive, but as acid is produced through the fermentation process, these bacteria die, and other kinds of bacteria start to take over. This brings to mind the need to take extra care to monitor microbial populations during the fermentation process to ensure that the project is not spoiling or going bad. A consistent temperature is required for effective fermentation to occur. Fortunately, today, we have access to all the best tools to make this happen. This is one of the benefits of living in the modern age. We're able to take a look back at the past and see what they did, while at the same time improving it. We have the amazing benefit of hindsight. DNA sequencing technology has been used to identify how bacteria fluctuate during the fermentation process, and therefore, we're able to better control their growth and prevent projects on an industrial scale from going bad. The future of fermentation in the modern age. So, what does fermentation look like today? What processes are different that would never have been used in the past due to the differences in available knowledge of the process and the lack of technology available back then? As we've seen, companies have started DNA sequencing technology in beer production. The same is true in the case of Japanese soy sauce manufacturers. Chinese researchers have been working in the area of shrimp paste production. What's clear is that companies have picked up the fermentation baton and that they are prepared to run with it. DNA sequencing is one of many technologies that are emerging now that fermentation of food has gone mainstream. Genetic modification is the way in which genetic material within bacteria is modified in order to create organisms with more desirable traits. Bacteria can be programmed to produce enzymes that react in the best possible way with food. Different types of fermentation. The beauty of fermentation is that there is a different kind of process for each kind of food. In some instances, there are multiple processes that can be used on the same food with different results. We've already covered these in brief detail earlier in this guide, but it's time to take a closer look at what these kinds of fermentation are all about. Lactic acid is created by lactic acid-producing bacteria. During this oxygen-free process, known as an anaerobic process, starches and sugars are broken down to form lactic acid. Lactic acid acts as a preservative because it hinders the formation of harmful bacteria, but it can also boost the immune system. Lactic acid is common in foods like milk, buttermilk, sauerkraut, yogurt, pickled vegetables, dill pickles, and many other kinds of fermented foods. Ethanol is another substance which is the byproduct of fermentation. In this process, sugars are broken down into alcohol by the yeast. Carbon dioxide molecules are produced by this process. It is important when making wine or beer, as well as in the production of beer. Acetic acid is the final product of fermentation that we will examine. The oxidation process during fermentation converts sugar from grains and fruit into acetic acid, which has a sour or bitter taste. You can taste the difference in foods like apple cider vinegar and apple juice, for example. The difference is that one has been allowed to ferment due to the action of acetic acid. These various types of fermentation point to the versatility of bacteria in changing the chemical nature of food. We see that different flavors, textures, and sensations are created when food goes through the fermentation process, because every strain of bacteria or yeast is different. Every strain has a different genetic code, and thus different enzymes are produced by this bacteria, resulting in a different action on the food itself. Chapter 4. Getting Started. Planning, Preparation, and Considerations. It's time to put your knowledge of fermentation into practice. This is the moment when you take the step from theory into making your ideas a reality. There are some things you're going to need to know before you get started. First, you're going to plan your project. Decide what you want to make, purchase the right ingredients, decide how long it is going to ferment for, and then decide how you're going to store the fermented food. Fortunately, the process of fermentation doesn't require a ton of equipment or tools, but there are still specific items you're going to require. You're also going to want to be aware of specific tips and hints for keeping everything sanitary. So let's get into it. Planning your fermentation project. The advantages of fermenting at home. Fermenting at home allows you to take control of the fermentation process. You're able to take your time, and you won't feel rushed if you have all the ingredients you need right there in your kitchen. Sure, you can buy fermented ingredients ready-made in any grocery store, but these are often expensive. You can save money and learn something interesting about fermenting food in the process by fermenting at home. You can choose the length of time you want to ferment food for, and you can choose what spices or ingredients you want to add. The entire process is in your hands. The ingredients. Decide what ingredients you're going to work with. This will be largely dependent on what your budget is like, what ingredients you have on hand, and what you're willing to work with. If you don't like certain kinds of foods, you're not going to enjoy eating them whether they're fermented or not. So, personal choice and preference does play a large role in the planning phase of your fermentation project. If you're a beginner, you may decide to stick with tried and trusted ingredients. Sauerkraut is one of the most common vegetables you'll be using. You can use similar vegetables to cabbage as well, such as kale. As mentioned before, avoid trying to ferment meat or fish, as these contain bacteria which can be harmful if ingested. As a beginner or someone who is starting out in fermenting, stick to vegetables, fruits, grains, cheese, and yogurt. These are tried and trusted ingredients that work well with fermenting, and they won't pose significant risk to your health. So, before you start the fermenting process, sort out what foods are going to be the target of your fermentation process, decide what kind of fermentation you want to take place, and ensure that you have purchased the right ingredients or that you have these ingredients on hand. Time frame. Once you've worked out what foods you want to use, you need to decide on the quantity of food that is going to be fermented and how long the process is going to take. You'll need to plan ahead so that you don't end up with too much fermented food and risk having it go bad, or having to throw some of it away because you can't store it. Always be sure of how long you have to complete your projects and set a realistic time frame for the fermentation process. In some instances, the process will take longer than in others, so you just need to be aware of what the timescales are for different fruits, vegetables, grains, dairy, and other food items. One of the easiest vegetables to work with is pickles. You can obtain them cheaply, plentifully, and they are hard to mess up if you are attempting the fermentation process for the first time. Think about fruit, vegetables, and other food items that will ferment relatively quickly so that you can see if you're getting the right ratios of ingredients, the right temperatures, and if your methods are working. If you have to wait several days for your project to be ready, you're going to be less inclined to try fermentation in the future. Plan your method. You'll need to plan the method of fermentation. What kinds of receptacles and tools will you require? How are the ingredients going to be prepared in such a way that they will work within the context of the recipe? Most importantly of all, You'll need to create a perfectly sterile environment that is at the right temperature for your yeast or bacteria to work effectively. Set up your kitchen so that you can create the most efficient environment for fermentation. Have all the dishes ready and waiting so that you can transfer food as necessary. Ensure that the kitchen or room you're working is at the correct temperature, and make sure that all your dishes you're using to store the food are properly cleaned and sterilized to avoid any contamination of the fermentation project. Preparing for your fermentation project. What you'll need. There are several items you're going to require before you start the process of fermentation. Let's look at some of these items in more detail. Mason jars. Mason jars can store almost anything, such as pickles, vegetables, and sauerkraut. The advantage of these containers is that they are thick and can maintain the steady core temperature needed in order to assist the fermentation process. Also, they are usually clear, which allows light into them and therefore heat as well. Many times, fermentation will require the presence of light and heat in order to take place, and thus these jars are useful in facilitating that. Miscellaneous containers. Any other kind of glass bowl, dish, or container can work if you're fermenting food. Metal dishes can work, but avoid using them as some of the acids and bases within the fermented food can interact with the metal covering of the dish and leave marks or stains. It's better to stick to glass as it doesn't stain too much. Choose dishes that can hold the food that you're going to be using and will be big enough. Make sure you use containers with lids, or if you're using mason jars, that they have tightly fitting lids. Ensure that you can seal these lids. Some lids come with a rubber ring that helps to create a vacuum seal. If a lid doesn't have a ring, just ensure that you screw it as tightly as possible to create the necessary airtight seal. Spoons, spatulas, and forks. Have a variety of spoons, spatulas, and forks available for stirring the contents of your fermentation project. Ensure that these are clean and thoroughly sterilized before use. In fact, it would be a good idea to ensure that all of your dishes that you're going to use are completely clean before the fermentation process begins. Even dishes that are slightly tarnished can have an impact on the fermentation process, so hygiene is paramount in this case. Sanitation and best safety considerations. Sanitation is key to healthy and successful fermentation projects. That much is true. You wouldn't cook any of your meals on dirty plates or in dirty cookware, and the same is true when you're fermenting. You need the most spotless of dishes. There is more to it, however. Some kinds of ingredients require absolutely spotless dishes in order to ferment properly. This is particularly true in the case of ingredients such as cheese and yogurt. Let's look at what these specific terms mean in the context of fermentation. Sanitization is not the same as sterilization. Sanitization means to clean something extremely well. When you sanitize something, you clean it of all external mess and grime. When you sterilize something, however, you take it through a different process. Sterilization is when you kill all bacteria on surfaces through the use of chemicals or another cleaning agent. You don't generally want to sterilize your dishes because it's not necessary. You definitely want to sanitize your dishes, and for most home fermentation projects, this will be enough. Let's look a little more at this process of preparing your jars and dishes. When should you clean your dishes? Ideally, your dishes should be cleaned at the start of the process. For some foods, sanitization is more important than at other times. Sanitization is always necessary when you're making wine, hard cheese, and beer. You also want to sanitize thoroughly if you're going to be keeping the ferment going for more than a few days or for a few weeks. If your home experiences mold or mildew, you're going to have to keep your fermentation project very clean and free from unwanted microorganisms. This, again, is more important when you're fermenting foods for more than just a few days. If the container you were using was contaminated by another form of yeast during a previous fermentation project that went wrong, for example, you're going to want to ensure that it is absolutely spotless before use. If it is not spotless, your current fermentation project is going to be tainted by what was previously in the jar or dish. Basic steps for sanitization. Let's take a quick look at the processes involved with sanitization. Tie your hair up so that it is out of the way of your food preparation. Wash your hands thoroughly with soap and water. Wipe down all your countertops and work surfaces with a disinfectant solution to kill any harmful germs and bacteria. Sanitize and clean all of your jars and equipment with boiling water and dry them thoroughly with clean towels. You're nearly ready to begin fermenting. Tips, best practices, and pitfalls to avoid. Here are a few more tips for really getting the most out of the fermentation experience. It all begins with how you clean your dishes. We've looked at the process in general, but these are further guidelines for getting your dishes absolutely spick and span. Make sure that you use boiling water in the right way. If you're making a large batch of food, ensure that you have many jars and dishes. You can clean them by placing a large pot on the stove and filling it halfway with boiling water. You're going to need enough to cover all the dishes. Make sure that you're using dishes that are not heat sensitive. Place the dishes in the water and bring it to the boil. Allow the dishes to boil for approximately 10 minutes or so. By then, they should be sterilized and completely clean of any harmful mold or bacteria. Alternatively, you can boil the water first, place it in the sink or in a tub, and wash your dishes in this way. Make sure that the water is cool enough to place your hands in before washing, though, or you could end up with a nasty burn. You can also fill the dishes or jars with water and just leave them for a few minutes. This works if you only have a few dishes or one dish to wash. Don't make use of boiling water on plastic or wooden items. You can make use of commercial sanitizers if you're making beer, wine, or hard cheeses. Fill your kitchen sink with hot water and then use sanitizer in the water. Leave this water in the sink while you're busy preparing your dishes. If you drop something or need to clean something again, the water will be there for you. Make sure that you rinse and dry dishes thoroughly prior to use, as some sanitizers can kill the bacteria or yeast in your food. Troubleshooting the fermenting process. Fermenting is tough to mess up, but there are common things that can hinder the process or cause things to go awry. It is not a fail-safe method for preparing food, and you do need to be aware of how you're going to go about setting up your fermentation project. We've already looked at cleanliness. This is one aspect of preparing for a fermentation project. Now, let's look at what can commonly go wrong so that you'll have the full picture of what fermentation entails and what you can expect. What can go wrong? Common pitfalls. Too much light affects the behavior of bacteria and can cause them to go into overdrive, as it were. Or it can inhibit the growth of bacteria altogether. Ultraviolet light can destroy bacteria and nutrition in food. Thus, it is best if you keep your fermentation projects out of direct sunlight, but still illuminated by indirect sunlight. The rule of thumb to follow is plenty of light, just not too much light. The wrong temperature can interfere with the process of fermentation. Not enough brine can cause your fermented food to be too dry or to not ferment at all. Always make sure that your salted water covers the food completely. As the days pass, this water level may change, so keep an eye on it. Add more as necessary. Don't pack your containers too full of the ingredient. Some ingredients can expand as they ferment, which can lead to problems with the container that they are in. Always fill your container about halfway or 2/3 full to avoid the problem of overexpansion. Avoid getting any kind of other bacteria or mold in the container. This can cause the fermented product to rot or go off. Maximize your ferment. Using high-quality ingredients ensures that there is less chance of your ferment going bad or starting to smell. These ingredients might be more expensive, but they tend to last longer and taste a lot better. Adding the right amount of salt is critical to the success of the fermentation project. Adding too much salt can kill the bacteria in the food. On the other hand, adding too little salt won't cause the fermentation project to even get off the ground. Always carefully consult the recipe in order to determine how much salt you need. Use the right kind of cabbage, cut just right. If your vegetables are cut and sliced unevenly, some parts could ferment before others, leading to an inconsistent fermentation process. Try to keep food cut the same way when fermenting. Add enough brine to prevent food from drying out. This is critical to the success of the fermentation project as well. Too little brine can cause mushy and washed out flavors and textures. Seal the container properly to avoid any unwanted organisms from accessing the container. In addition, some types of fermentation don't require oxygen in order to take place, so their containers should be completely airtight. Ferment within the ideal temperature range, anywhere between 65 degrees Fahrenheit to 72 degrees Fahrenheit. This determines the rate of fermentation and is thus important. It's worth noting that all of the items on this list are small things, but collectively, they can impact the success, taste, and flavor of a fermentation project. Always pay attention to detail, and you'll enjoy the results later. Chapter 5. Easy recipes to get started with. Let's get started with the basics. The recipes in this chapter are the easiest recipes when it comes to fermenting food. Fermenting, in general, is a straightforward process, but there are things that can go wrong. Making use of these recipes eliminates some of that risk because they are tried and tested recipes. Sauerkraut. Serving size, 8. Prep time, 15 minutes. Ingredients, 1½ tablespoons of kosher salt, 1 medium-sized head of green cabbage, approximately 3 pounds. 1 tablespoon caraway seeds, optional, but improves the flavor somewhat. Equipment, 1 sealable mason jar, 1 smaller jelly jar that can easily fit into the mouth of the mason jar. Directions. First, ensure that all your dishes are clean and sterilized. Give your hands a good wash while you're at it. Slice the cabbage into even quarters and remove the core. Discard the bruised, brown, or wilted leaves. Slice each quarter into half and then into ribbons. Place the cabbage into a large bowl and cover it with salt. Start to massage it gently until you start to see water emerge from the cabbage. Continue this process for about 10 minutes, by which time the cabbage should have become soft and limp and be surrounded by quite a lot of water. Add any additional flavorings now, i.e. the caraway. Start placing the cabbage into the mason jar and tamp it down with your fist every so often. If there is additional water, pour this off. Once the cabbage is in the jar, and after pouring off the water, place the jelly jar on top of the cabbage. This should ensure that the cabbage is weighed down. Cover the mouth of the jar with a tea towel and secure it in place using a rubber band. Press the cabbage once every 24 hours. Ensure that the water level of the jar never falls below the cabbage. Add extra liquid if needed. Keep the jar in indirect sunlight. Ferment for up to 3 days if needed. When done, the cabbage should be soft and limp and should have plenty of liquid in the jar. After 3 days, remove the jelly jar and add the lid of the mason jar, screwing it on tightly. During the process, you'll see small white bubbles rise to the surface. These are normal and a sign that the fermentation process is going well. Kimchi. Serving size, 6. Prep time, 5 minutes. Ingredients, 1 small head of cabbage, 1 small head of bok choy, Chinese cabbage, 3 sliced green onions, 1 cup of shredded daikon, 8 to 10 cloves of garlic, 1 piece of fresh ginger, 1 cup of shredded carrots, 1½ tablespoons of Himalayan sea salt, 1 to 2 teaspoons of red pepper flakes. Equipment: 1 large mason jar, cleaned, 1 small jelly jar that can fit into the mouth of the mason jar. Directions: reserve 1 outer leaf of the cabbage. Roughly chop the cabbage, bok choy, and green onions. Place them in a large bowl. Mix in the daikon, carrot, and the salt. Smash the ingredients together using your hand or a blunt object and continue to massage until the cabbage starts to release its water. Set the greens aside, mince the garlic, grate the ginger, and combine into the cabbage mixture along with the red pepper flakes. Combine this mixture with the greens. Place the mixture in a mason jar and press down. You should be surprised at the amount of liquid that is released. Place the outer cabbage leaf over the top of the ingredients in the jar to make sure that they are covered and that they stay under the water. Place the glass jelly jar over the top of the vegetables to ensure that they are weighed down. Finally, allow the kimchi to sit for days, or at least weeks, in order to ferment properly. Halfway through the process, take the jelly jar out of the mason jar and seal the lid onto the mason jar. Keep the kimchi outside in indirect light for a few days and then place it inside the fridge for the rest of the process. Pickled vegetables. Serving size: serves 8. Prep time: 10 minutes. Ingredients: 1 quart room temperature water, 2 to 3 tablespoons of kosher salt or fine sea salt. Vegetables of your choice, cut into even pieces. Seasoning of your choice. Equipment: several mason jars with lids. Directions: prepare the dishes by sanitizing them. Prepare the brine by combining the warm water and the salt and leaving aside to cool. Add your seasoning to the jars. Slice the radishes, carrots, or whatever vegetables you're using and add them to the jars. Pour the brine into the jars, pack the vegetables tightly so that the level of water is higher. Screw on the lid so that it forms an airtight seal. Leave the vegetables to ferment for 7 to 14 days before using. Kombucha. Serving size: makes about 1 gallon. Prep time: about 10 minutes. Ingredients: 3½ quarts of water, 8 black tea bags, 1 cup of white sugar. Kombucha starter tea. This is kombucha which is already aged and which has the yeast and active bacteria needed in order to ferment. 1 SCOBY per jar of kombucha you're planning to make. A SCOBY is a cellulose mat that houses all the bacteria that you're using during the fermentation process. These can be purchased online or from health stores. Optional ingredients include chopped fruit, honey, or spices of your choosing. Directions: make the base for the tea. Bring the water to the boil, remove it from the heat, and add the sugar and allow it to dissolve. Add the tea and allow the mixture to cool. Once cooled, remove the tea bags and add the starter tea. Transfer the tea along with the starter to jars and add the SCOBY to the top of the jars. Add 1 SCOBY per gallon. If you're using 2-gallon jars, use 2 SCOBYs. Cover the jars with paper towels or a clean tea towel and secure with a rubber band. Ferment the mixture for 7 to 10 days. You can add the other ingredients if you wish after this. If possible, keep the mixture out of direct sunlight. Pickles. Serving size: a ½ gallon of pickles. Prep time: 15 minutes. Ingredients: 6 cups of non-chlorinated water, 4 tablespoons of kosher salt, 5 bay leaves, 1 teaspoon dill seeds, 8 garlic cloves, 1 teaspoon mustard seeds, 1 teaspoon black peppercorns, 1/2 teaspoon red pepper flakes, enough small pickling cucumbers to fill a 1/2 gallon jar. This will be about 1 pound. 1 small jelly jar to use as a weight. 1 mason jar sanitized. Directions: add the salt to the water to create a brine. Add 2 of the leaves to the bottom of the glass mason jar. Add half of the following ingredients to the bottom of the jar: the garlic cloves, chili flakes, mustard seeds, peppercorns, and dill. Add half of the cucumbers, pack them firmly but not too tightly. Add the brined water over the top of the cucumbers so that it covers them. Add 2 leaves to the top of the jar. Add the rest of the ingredients to the top of the jar. Press down the cucumbers so that they are submerged in the water. Place the remaining bay leaf on top of the ingredients and weigh them down with the jelly jar, or a weight of your choosing. If you're using a stone, ensure that it is also completely submerged and cover the top of the jar with a tea towel or paper towel held in place with a rubber band. Leave the pickles to ferment for about 10 days, then test them. If you prefer them more sour, then leave them for a longer period. Chapter 6. Vegetables. We've taken a look at some easy recipes. Now let's delve specifically into vegetables. These are still so easy to prepare and to ferment because they require little preparation. For many of these recipes, the steps will be similar, so we're going to rocket through this chapter to give you a brief overview of what you need to do with them. Simple fermented vegetables. Carrots. Serving size: 8 servings. Prep time: 5 minutes. Ingredients: 3 cups of water, 2 to 3 teaspoons of kosher salt, 1½ pounds of carrots, cut and prepared in even pieces, preferably short strips that can easily stack within a jar. Equipment: mason jars of various sizes. Directions: combine the water and salt together in a bowl and ensure that the salt is dissolved to form a brine. Add the prepared carrots to a mason jar and ensure they are packed firmly but not too tightly. Pour the brine mixture over the top. Cover the jars loosely with the lids and leave them for about 24 to 48 hours at room temperature. After the first 24 hours, you should see bubbles forming on the surface of the water. Once you see these, transfer the jars to your refrigerator. Leave the jars in your refrigerator for 1 to 2 weeks in order to fully ferment. Mushrooms. There are many varieties of mushrooms. The best kind to use in fermentation are those which are dense. Serving size: 6 servings. Prep time: 5 minutes. Ingredients: 4 pounds of fresh mushrooms of your choice, 3 tablespoons of kosher salt, spices and seasonings of your choice, coarse black pepper, 4 cups of filtered water. Directions: boil the mushrooms for a few minutes in salted water, 1 tablespoon of salt for every 2 cups of water. In a small bowl, combine the seasonings and spices. Add the ingredients to mason jars or glass dishes in layers. Firstly, start by adding a layer of salt, followed by the mushrooms, followed by the spice mixture. Pack the mushrooms down firmly, but not too tightly. Continue layering until the jar is full, until at least 2 inches of space are left at the top. Add a final layer of salt. Add some weight to the top of the mushrooms and leave them to sit for 4 days in a cool, dark place. Check to make sure that the mushrooms are completely covered in their brine. After 4 days, place the jars in the fridge and leave them for up to several months. Garlic. Prep time: 10 minutes. Ingredients: whole heads of garlic, any variety you like, enough to fill the container or jar you'll be using. Kosher salt, about ½ teaspoon per cup of water you're using. Filtered water, as required. Directions: peel the amount of garlic cloves you'll need to fill the container or jar. Dissolve the salt in the water to create a salt brine. Add the brine to the jars. Attach the lids loosely to the jars and leave them to stand in indirect sunlight for about a week. After a week, you'll be able to use the garlic cloves. Be sure to open the jar once a day to remove the pressure created by fermentation. Sweet potato. Serving size, 2 quarts. Prep time, 10 minutes. Ingredients: 5 pounds sweet potatoes, 1 large onion, diced, 1 small piece of peeled ginger, grated, 1 teaspoon of cayenne. Directions: combine the slices of sweet potato, ginger, cayenne, and onion in a large bowl. Massage all of the ingredients together to get the potatoes to release their water. Pack the potato mixture down into the jars or containers you're going to be using. Push down with your hands until the level of water is higher than the vegetables. Use available weights to assist with this crushing process. Place in a cool place, cover, and leave to ferment for about 10 days. Zucchini. Serving size, 16 ounces. Prep time, 20 minutes. Ingredients: about 7 ounces of zucchini, 200 grams. 1 cup of filtered water. 2.5 teaspoons of kosher salt. Equipment: mason jars. Fermentation weights. Directions: wash all of your dishes and fermentation equipment before use. Wash the vegetables in water before use. Slice the zucchini in the shape you'd like. Add the salt to the water and create a brine. Place your zucchini in mason jars, pat it down tightly, and pour the brine over the top. Place fermentation weights in the jars. Cover the jars with tea towels fastened with rubber bands and leave the jars to ferment for approximately 14 days before placing them in the fridge. Chapter 7. Fruits. There are 2 different methods of fermenting fruit. We show you one using a sweet brine and the other using a salty brine. Both are absolutely delicious. You can try out the recipe on any fruit you choose. We've chosen to use blueberries for our fermentation project. Blueberries. Salt method. Yield: makes about 2 cups of blueberries. Prep time: 10 minutes. Ingredients: 300 grams of blueberries, 2 teaspoons of kosher salt. Equipment: mason jars, fermentation weights. Directions: add the blueberries to a bowl. Add the salt over the top and massage slightly until a small amount of water starts to emerge. Pour the mixture into jars and weigh it down. Ensure that there is no oxygen in the jars. Place the lids loosely on the jars. Leave the jars for about 3 to 7 days, refrigerating after the first 24 hours. Pro tip: you can follow this process for any other form of berry: cranberries, raspberries, blackberries, etc. Most kinds of berries will work with this method. Pineapples. Sugar method. Serving size: makes about a gallon. Prep time: 5 minutes. Ingredients: 2 pineapples, 2 cups of sugar, water, enough to cover the fruit. Equipment: mason jars or other vessel. Fermentation weight. Directions: cut the tops off of the pineapples and peel them. Reserve the peelings. Dissolve the sugar in the warm water. In a mason jar or other vessel, place the pineapple peelings. Cover them with the sugar solution so that it covers the contents of the jar. Place a weight on top of the peelings. Place the jar or jars in a warm place out of direct sunlight for about 5 days. You can leave it longer if you want it to be more tart, or if you want to adjust the level of fizziness. Chapter 8. Beverages. In this chapter, we're going to briefly cover what you need to do in order to prepare each of the delicious beverage recipes. This section is clearly divided into both alcoholic and non-alcoholic drinks for those who like either one or the other type. Non-alcoholic. Milk kefir recipe. Serving size: 2 cups. Prep time: 24 hours, 10 initial minutes. Ingredients: 2 cups of milk, organic whole milk recommended, 1 teaspoon of active kefir grains. These can be purchased in the health food section of the grocery store. Equipment: glass jar, tea towel, or cheesecloth. Directions: sterilize your jars and containers thoroughly. Place the kefir grains into the empty and dry glass jar you're going to use and pour in the slightly warmed whole milk over the top. Stir the mixture well, but leave about half the jar empty in order to have room for expansion. Cover the jar with a tea towel or cheesecloth and secure it with a rubber band. Let the mixture rest on the counter at room temperature for around 24 hours. If the room temperature is higher than 68 degrees Fahrenheit, place the jar in the fridge for that same period. After 24 hours, taste the kefir. If the taste is to your preference, strain the kefir over a large bowl. Retain the grains for your next project and serve the kefir as desired. If you prefer it to be more fermented, leave it for a longer period of time. Homemade soda. Making your own homemade soda is the best way to keep healthy and avoid unwanted calories. This lemon-flavored recipe is sweetened with honey. Serving size: 1 gallon. Prep time: 20 minutes. Ingredients: 1 gallon of filtered water, juice of 2 Meyer lemons, 1 tablespoon of honey. Equipment: large glass jars, tea towel or cheesecloth. Directions: combine the lemon juice, honey, and water in large glass jars. Cover the tops of the jars with breathable material. Fasten the tops securely with rubber bands. Stir the mixture twice daily and leave it to ferment for approximately 7 to 20 days. After the 7th day, place the mixture in the fridge and leave it to ferment further. You want to leave the mixture for at least 3 weeks, monitoring it carefully. You can arrest the fermentation progress anytime you want, but the longer you leave it, the more flavor will develop. Kvass. Serving size: serves 24. Prep time: 14 hours, minus fermentation. Ingredients: 10 quarts of water, 1 pound of rye bread, sliced, 1 handful of raisins, 1½ tablespoons of dry yeast, 1.8 pounds of sugar. Equipment: containers or jars. Directions: fill a large pot with about 2 gallons of water and bring it to the boil. Put your rye in the toaster and turn the heat up high. The bread should be as dark as possible without being burnt. When the water begins to boil, remove the pot from the heat, add a handful of raisins, and add the bread to the pot, cover it, and leave it to stand overnight. The next day, remove the toasted bread and throw it away. In a bowl, mix the sugar, yeast, and bread water mixture. Stir it well. Place the mixture into a container or jars. Cover it with plastic wrap and ensure that it stands for 6 hours. Stir every so often. After 6 hours, remove and discard the raisins. Place the jarred kvass mixture into the fridge with the lid loosely on and leave it overnight. Once the bottles are chilled, you can tighten the lids. After about 2 or 3 days, you can enjoy it, depending on your preference. Mead. Serving size: serves 32 people. Prep time: 30 minutes. Ingredients: 2 gallons of filtered water, 2 to 3 pounds of honey, fruit of any kind, including berries, 1 orange, 10 raisins, a half a packet of dry yeast. Equipment: large jug. Directions: heat a half a gallon of water in a large pot on the stove over a medium heat. Once it's warm, add the honey and allow it to dissolve. Add the fruit to the mixture and combine it thoroughly. Add the mixture to a large jug. Add the rest of the water to the jug and let the mixture cool slightly. Make sure that the temperature of the mixture is below 90 degrees Fahrenheit and add the yeast. Mix thoroughly. Cover the jug and place in a dark, cool place. Leave for about 4 to 6 weeks until fully fermented and begin the aging process. Wine. Serving size 32. Prep time 5 minutes. Ingredients: 1 package of dry yeast, 0.25 ounces, 1 fluid ounce of juice concentrate. You can use any flavor except citrus for this. 3.5 quarts of cold water, 4 cups of sugar. Equipment: 1 gallon jug, rubber balloon, sanitized. Directions: combine the yeast, juice, and sugar in a 1 gallon jug. Fill the jug to the top with cold water. Place a sanitized rubber balloon over the top of the jug and secure it with a rubber band. Place in a cool, dry place. Over the next few days, observe the rubber balloon. It should expand. When it has deflated back to size, the wine is ready to drink. This process takes about 6 weeks. Beer. Serving size 32. Prep time 10 minutes. Ingredients for brewing: 2 gallons of filtered water, 6 pounds of canned malt syrup, 1.5 ounces hop pellets, a large amount of ice. Ingredients for fermentation: 3 gallons of cold water, 1 packet of dry brewer's yeast or ale yeast. Baker's yeast will not work. Equipment: large funnel, 6-gallon fermenting container, airlock. Directions: bring 2 gallons of water to a boil. Stir in the malt extract and ensure that it incorporates without burning or sticking. The mixture should be lightly simmering at this stage. Add in a little malt at a time. Once done, bring the water back to the boil and add 1/2 ounce of the hops. Boil for 55 minutes. Turn the heat down to avoid the mixture boiling over. After this period, add the remaining hops. Boil for 5 minutes. Fill the sink with water and ice. Pour the contents of the yeast pack into 1 cup of lukewarm water. Pour about 3 gallons of water into the fermenting container you're going to be using. Pour the cooled syrup solution into the fermenting container as well. Stir the combination together. Sprinkle the yeast over the surface of the mixture. Place a lid over the fermenter and store in a cool, dark place for a period of about 14 days. The temperature should be about 70 degrees Fahrenheit. Chapter 9. Seeds, Beans, and Grains. Grains. Sourdough starter. Ingredients: whole wheat flour, water, unbleached flour. To make the starter, 1/2 cup of whole wheat flour, 1/4 cup of water. To feed the starter, 1/2 cup unbleached flour, 1/4 cup of water. Directions: make the starter. Combine the whole wheat flour and water in a large jar and mix well. Cover with a lid and leave to stand in a warm place for about 24 hours. The ambient temperature should be about 80 degrees Fahrenheit. You should start to see bubbles forming over the next few days, but don't worry if you don't see these. Just be patient and leave the mixture to keep fermenting. Try not to interfere with it too much. By the 3rd day, you're going to be ready to feed your starter. Remove and discard about half the starter. You should have around 2 ounces remaining. Add the flour and water you set aside to feed your starter and mix thoroughly. The dough should be stretchy. Replace the lid and keep feeding for the next 3 days. Repeat the same process. When your starter falls, feed it again. By day 7, your starter should be ready. Transfer it to a jar and keep it in a cool, dry place. Use as desired. Beans. Hummus. Serving size 2 cups. Prep time 10 minutes. Ingredients: 1 1/4 cups of dried chickpeas, 1 teaspoon of baking soda, 2 cloves of garlic, 1/2 cup of tahini paste, 1/2 cup of water, 1/4 cup lemon juice, Salt to taste. 2 tablespoons of fermentation culture of your choice. Miso, apple cider vinegar, or dairy cultures. A glug of olive oil. Equipment: glass jar. Directions: soak the dried chickpeas in water for about 8 hours prior to preparation. Drain them, place them in a saucepan, and cover with water. Add the baking soda to the pot. Bring to a boil and cook for about 40 minutes. Once they're soft, start the next stage of the process. Drain the water off the chickpeas and place them in a food processor along with the garlic. Add the tahini and lemon juice and blitz them. Blend until smooth, adding water as needed. When blended and smooth, allow to cool and add seasoning as desired. To ferment, add in the culture and transfer the mix to a glass jar. Cover with a tea towel and leave to stand for up to 12 hours. Chapter 10. Dairy. In this chapter, we take a brief look at the world of fermented dairy. The recipes listed below are not exhaustive, but from them, you can make your own dishes and expand on them in any way you choose. This is a brief overview of what the recipes are and what ingredients you'll need. Yogurt. Serving size, 4 cups. Prep time, 45 minutes, excluding standing time. Ingredients: 4 cups of milk, 3 tablespoons of plain yogurt or yogurt starter powder. Flavors: dulce de leche, honey, etc. Equipment: mason jars, incubator or yogurt maker, candy thermometer. Directions: to make homemade yogurt, bring 4 cups of milk to the boil. Stir over a moderate heat until the temperature reaches 180 degrees Fahrenheit. Make sure the milk doesn't burn or boil over. Remove from the heat and allow to cool to 115 degrees Fahrenheit. To speed up the process, place the milk in a bowl set over some ice or ice water. You can do this in your sink. Mix a little yogurt with some milk in a cup until smooth. Do not stir vigorously. Add the solution to the cooling milk and then to containers or jars. Incubate at around 110 degrees Fahrenheit for around 10 hours. Once cooled, cover and place in the refrigerator for about 3 hours. Add any desired flavorings to the yogurt. Cheese. Serving size, 10. Prep time, 1 hour, excluding resting time. Ingredients: 1 gallon whole milk. Equipment: colander, muslin cloth. Directions: heat 1 gallon of whole milk in a saucepan over a medium heat. Once the milk reaches 100 degrees Fahrenheit, use a thermometer to measure. Add 2 tablespoons of rennet. Stir into the milk until the curds start to separate from the whey. Lower the heat and leave to sit for another 10 minutes. During this time, a large blob will form. Cut this blob into smaller pieces. The size of the blobs determines the consistency of your cheese. Smaller equals coarser and drier cheese. Use a cheese harp to divide the cheese curds. Transfer the mixture to a colander lined with muslin cloth. Tie it up and cover it with a weight. Leave the cheese to drain for 5 hours at room temperature. Once it has stood, unwrap it, cut into pieces, season with salt, and serve it. Sour cream. Sour cream is fermented using a culturing agent such as cultured buttermilk or sour cream culture. Start by mixing 1/4 cup of the culturing agent with 1 cup of whipping cream. Mix the culture and the cream and leave it in a glass jar. Attach the lid loosely and leave to stand for 12 to 24 hours. Use within 3 weeks. Serving size, 1 1/4 cup of sour cream. Prep time, 5 minutes. Ingredients: 1/4 cup of culturing agent, buttermilk or sour cream culture, and 1 cup of whipping cream. Equipment: glass jar. Directions: start by mixing 1/4 cup of the culturing agent with 1 cup of whipping cream. Mix the culture and the cream and leave it in a glass jar. Attach the lid loosely and leave to stand for 12 to 24 hours. Use within 3 weeks. Chapter 11. Other great fermented food and drink options. Finally, we're going to take a look at other fun items you can try to ferment in your free time. Some of these items are closely related to the foods we've already looked at, but the most important thing is that they are all delicious. This section gives a brief overview of these foods. Tempeh. Tempeh is a food full of vitamin B12. It is made of fermented soybean paste and is a common alternative to meat. Salsa. Fermented salsa is a delicious side dish made with tomatoes, kefir, salt, and whey protein. It can be made in many different ways and can be customized to your taste. Cider. Cider is an alcoholic drink made of various kinds of fruit. Apple cider is one of the most well-known varieties, but there are many others you can try. Natto. Natto is a Japanese food made of soybeans that have been fermented. It is often served along with other breakfast foods and with rice. Miso paste. Miso is a salty, pleasant-tasting soybean product that is used as a seasoning in Asian soups and other dishes. It is growing increasingly popular in many Western countries as well. Ginger beer. Ginger beer is a non-alcoholic drink made by fermenting yeast with sugar, ginger, lemon juice, and water. It is one of the most popular drinks of all time. Conclusion. So, we've arrived at the end of our journey into the wonderful world of fermentation. We've covered many different topics, not least of which is the amazing potential that fermentation can have on our lives. We looked at what fermentation means, the history of fermentation, and the science behind it. We examined the benefits that fermented food can have on our bodies, and we examined the delicious recipes that can be made with all kinds of fermented foods. But the most important question is what we can do with this information and what the future holds for this unique method of preparing food. The truth of the matter is that fermentation is evolving. Industries and companies are using increasingly streamlined methods to make the fermentation process more efficient. This is part of a broader move toward a more technologically advanced society than ever before. All we can do is to go along with it and continue to live healthier and happier lives. Eating tasty fermented food is only one part of this, but it is a significant piece in the puzzle of our lives. Glossary. Antibiotics. Medications and sterilizing agents whose purpose is to eliminate microbiotic life within the human body. Bacteria. A kind of microbe that acts upon the environment that it finds itself, either in a positive or negative way. Colony-forming units. This is a term referring to a measure of unit for bacterial formations. Enzymes. Proteins that are responsible for aiding the process of digestion. Fermento, a fermentation enthusiast. Flora, a term used to refer to microbial life within an organism or host. GRAS status, also known as generally recognized as safe status, the standard by which food is considered safe to eat. Fermented vegetables carry this status. Irradiation, a method by which food is made safe to eat through bombarding it with electrical impulses. Post-Pasteurian, one who advocates for fermentation in eating and who is opposed to antibiotic ways of preparing food. Probiotics, live bacteria that confer health benefits to the human body. Umami, the sixth taste, often described as somewhat salty, but definitely very pleasant and satisfying. Raw, food that has not been heated above 144 degrees Fahrenheit.